Belarus once depended heavily on a narrow but extremely strategic gateway to the outside world, its access to the Baltic Sea through neighboring countries. For years, this route functioned as Belarus's economic lifeline, allowing exports of potash, oil products, fertilizers, and industrial goods to reach global markets. It was not just a logistical corridor, but a symbol of Belarus's connection to Europe and international trade. However, a series of political decisions, miscalculations, and confrontations, centered largely around President Alexander Lukashenko's choices, slowly transformed this lifeline into a pressure point. What was once a dependable route has now effectively disappeared, leaving Belarus economically isolated and strategically cornered. The story begins with Belarus's geography. As a landlocked country, Belarus has no direct access to the sea. For decades, it relied on Baltic ports, particularly in Lithuania and Latvia, to ship goods abroad. The port of Klaipėda in Lithuania became especially critical. A significant portion of Belarusian exports passed through this port, generating billions of dollars in revenue and supporting thousands of jobs on both sides of the border. This arrangement was not built overnight. It was the result of long-term economic cooperation that survived multiple political changes in Europe. Even after the European Union expanded eastward, pragmatic trade relations continued because they benefited everyone involved. That balance began to shift after the disputed 2020 Belarusian presidential election, when Lukashenko declared victory amid widespread allegations of fraud. Massive protests erupted across Belarus. The government responded with force, arresting thousands, silencing opposition voices, and drawing sharp condemnation from the European Union. Sanctions followed, initially targeting individuals and later expanding to key sectors of the Belarusian economy. At this point, the Baltic port route was still open, but the trust that sustained it was already eroding. Lukashenko's response to EU pressure proved to be a turning point. Instead of seeking compromise or gradual de-escalation, he doubled down on confrontation. He openly accused the EU of trying to destabilize Belarus and aligned himself even more closely with Russia. One of the most controversial moments came in 2021, when Belarus forced a Ryanair passenger plane traveling between two EU countries to land in Minsk, leading to the arrest of an opposition journalist. This incident shocked Europe and fundamentally altered how the EU viewed Belarus not just as an authoritarian neighbor, but as a direct security threat. The consequences were swift and severe. The EU imposed new rounds of sanctions, including restrictions that directly affected Belarusian exports moving through EU territory. Lithuania, under pressure from Brussels and responding to its own security concerns, began limiting Belarusian access to Klaipėda. What had once been routine cargo movements turned into political liabilities. Each train of Belarusian goods passing through Baltic territory became a symbol of unresolved conflict. Lukashenko's next move is often described as the fatal mistake that sealed the fate of the Baltic port route. In an attempt to retaliate against EU sanctions, his government allegedly facilitated the movement of migrants from the Middle East and Africa toward the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Thousands of migrants were pushed toward EU frontiers, creating a humanitarian crisis and what European leaders described as a form of hybrid warfare. This act destroyed any remaining goodwill. For the EU, the issue was no longer just human rights or democracy, it was border security and sovereignty. From that moment on, cooperation collapsed. Lithuania accelerated plans to fully cut Belarusian cargo from its ports. Latvia and Estonia followed a similar path, reducing and eventually halting Belarus-linked shipments. The EU tightened sanctions further, targeting potash exports, one of Belarus's most profitable industries. Since potash accounted for a massive share of Belarusian export revenue, losing access to Baltic ports was economically devastating. Belarus attempted to pivot away from the Baltics by rerouting exports through Russian ports, particularly Ust-Luga near St. Petersburg. On paper, this seemed like a viable alternative. In reality, it introduced new problems. Russian ports were already operating near capacity, transportation distances were longer, and costs increased significantly. Belarus also lost bargaining power, becoming almost entirely dependent on Russia's infrastructure and political goodwill. What was once a diversified export strategy turned into a one-sided dependency. The economic impact inside Belarus was immediate and painful. Export revenues fell, foreign currency reserves came under pressure, and state-owned enterprises struggled to remain profitable. Workers in key industries faced uncertainty, reduced hours, and wage delays. While the government tried to mask these problems with official statistics and rhetoric, the underlying damage was impossible to hide. Losing the Baltic route did not just mean losing ports, it meant losing competitiveness in global markets. Politically, the shutdown reinforced Belarus's isolation. The EU decision to fully shut down port access sent a clear message. There would be no return to business as usual under Lukashenko's leadership. The ports were not just economic tools, they became leverage in a broader geopolitical standoff. By choosing confrontation over compromise, Lukashenko effectively pushed Belarus out of Europe's economic orbit. The irony is that the Baltic port route once served as a stabilizing factor in EU-Belarus relations. As long as trade flowed, there was incentive on both sides to manage disagreements quietly. When that route disappeared, so did the incentive for restraint. The EU could afford to be firm because it no longer depended on Belarusian cargo, and Belarus had fewer tools to influence European decision-making. Over time, the full shutdown of port access reshaped the regional balance. Lithuania and Latvia absorbed short-term economic losses but gained political clarity and security alignment with the EU. Belarus, meanwhile, became more tightly bound to Russia than ever before. This dependency limited its strategic autonomy and reduced its ability to maneuver internationally. Decisions about transport, energy, and trade increasingly required Moscow's approval or support. From Lukashenko's perspective, the gamble may have seemed necessary. Facing domestic unrest and external pressure, he chose survival through defiance rather than reform. However, the cost of that choice was enormous. The disappearance of the Baltic port route symbolized Belarus's broader exit from Europe. It was not a single decision but a chain of actions, each escalating tensions until cooperation became impossible. Looking ahead, the loss of the Baltic route will likely shape Belarus's future for years, if not decades. Rebuilding trust with the EU would require political changes that Lukashenko has consistently rejected. Even if leadership were to change, restoring port access would not be immediate. Contracts have been canceled, infrastructure investments redirected, and alternative supply chains established. Once lost, such strategic routes are extremely difficult to recover. In the end, the story of Belarus's vanished Baltic port route is not just about logistics or sanctions. It is about how political choices can erase decades of economic integration almost overnight. Lukashenko's fatal mistake was believing that Europe would blink first, that economic interdependence would outweigh security concerns and democratic values. Instead, the EU chose a full shutdown, accepting economic costs to uphold its principles and protect its borders. Belarus now stands at a crossroads, more isolated than at any point since the end of the Cold War. The Baltic Sea, once its window to the world, has effectively closed. What remains is a hard lesson in modern geopolitics. Access, trust, and cooperation are fragile, and once broken, they can vanish faster than anyone expects.